Okay, I'm going to try to continue the no shoes speaker theme here. Dave Thomas is a hard act to follow with that. I heard the organizers talking earlier that they were changing the name to the Ruby No Shoes Conference maybe next year. Is that right, Alan? And I don't know. Dave Thomas is not here. Not able to ask him, but I don't know what he was thinking of when he started with the no shoes theme. Maybe he just wanted the rest of us to look silly. But I'm wearing the sponsor socks, so thank you, Nav, for making this all possible. Thank you for making it possible to bring me here. And I want to thank very much the organizers, especially Alan, for thinking about inviting me here. I've come a long way. I've come from Manila in the Philippines. And this is my first time back in the US after almost 2 years of traveling as a digital nomad. So I'm psyched, very jazzed to be connecting with the Ruby community again. But we're here, I'm going to talk about Rails Composer today. It's a tool that you can use to generate starter apps, really quickly spin up apps, save yourselves a lot of time. It's an open source project. Rails Apps is the project I've been running for almost 5-6 years now. We're going to get right into actually using Rails Composer to generate a Rails application. We will actually build a full-featured Rails application within the space of about 2 or 3 minutes. But it's going to take me longer than that to actually walk through the menu and show you some of the options that you've got available with Rails Composer. So let's do that. And I'm going to show you how to do this right off the bat. There's a website. It's railscomposer.com. And if you fire up your laptop, fire up your terminal window, you can actually go to this website, copy and paste some code. You could actually type it in, copy it off the screen, but a lot easier to go to the website, copy and paste the code. It's the Rails new command. Now, we all know the Rails new command. That's what we use when we start any kind of simple application, when we start a new Rails project. The Rails new command is built into Rails and gives us a simple scaffold of a very simple, generic baby starter application. We don't even think about it as a starter application. We just think about it as a new project. But the core maintainers had the insight, the good thinking, to think that we could tie it into a scripting system that we could actually build a far more complex application using the Rails new command. And the Rails new command has this -m flag argument. So let's break that down. If you want to do this on your own laptop, you can do Rails new, any name you want for your project, my app, and then the -m. And you can either point it at a local file, local script on your machine, or you can point it out over the internet. In this case, it's a GitHub repository that contains a script that's a Rails application template. So I'm going to walk you through it right now. Either you do it yourself if you want, or just follow what I'm doing. If you enter that command, if you've got that. Oh, and I think we're going to generate a Rails application. And the first person who's actually got a running application, could you like shout out or jump up or wave your hand? This will be in about 10 minutes time, maybe, something like that. Because I've got some stickers. I've been traveling for 2 years. I've got stickers from the Rails Apps project. I've gone to user group meetings around the world, and I've given them away. I've got like just a handful, like 2 or 3 left. But you can have it if you generate a Rails application and let me know. So the first menu item is build a starter application, and you have 3 choices. The Rails Apps project has got a dozen example applications, and that's really the core of the project. We are maintaining, constantly updating, improving a set of generic starter applications that pretty much cover the basis of including, you'll see in a minute, including front end, like Bootstrap, authentication, authorization. The second option is there's nothing available yet in this version for Rails 5.0. You have to have the Rails gem installed before, if anyone's had any trouble with this yet from their terminal application, if you're going to actually run that Rails new command. But if you've got a great idea for a starter application that you think a lot of other people might want to use, you could actually, you can contact me, email, and I'll work with you to actually set up so we can actually have some contributed applications as well as the ones that I maintain as part of the Rails Apps project. Finally, some of you might have used Rails Composer already. Some skilled developers are using this custom application option. And that's where you can walk through a menu of a whole series of different options that typically you might, gems that you might be adding to your application or configuration that you might be setting up. I call it experimental because it's something of a minefield. I maintain the the composer for the kind of applications that I typically build, but I can't test everything and make sure that everything integrates together. So when you go into that custom application, there may be issues that come up. So simply report it on GitHub if you notice something. So right now, just choose number 1, the Rails app example application. There's a dozen applications to choose from. The Learn Rails, I have a book, Learn Ruby on Rails. It's a book for beginners, for people recommend Rails tutorial by Michael Hartle. If you've got some programming experience, yes, that's an awesome book. If you have a friend to recommend a book to who has no programming experience, the Learn Ruby on Rails book that I do is useful. This is an application that goes along with that book. Rails Bootstrap integrates the Bootstrap front-end framework. There's a foundation front-end framework as well. There's a simple application that lets you sign up for a mailing list using ActiveJob for background processing. There's OmniAuth for authentication. There's Devise for authentication. There's a combination of Devise and some simple role-based authorization. And we're going to actually try number 8. The Rails Devise Pundit is the most popular of the starter applications because it pretty much covers the basis of everything that people are going to want in as a beginning point for a custom application. That's Devise for authentication and Pundit for authorization for access control. There's also a couple of other options for signing up, having visitors sign up and download some digital content. And there's a couple of applications that integrate Stripe payments for credit card payment. You could actually build an app if you want to sell something on the internet. You can actually, in a couple of minutes, generate the starter app with Stripe integrated, and in an hour or two later, actually be selling something on the internet. Now, this option, please consider signing up for the mailing list for Rails Composer. It's my way of staying in touch with the user base. It's my way of letting people know if there's announcements about new features that are coming. It's up to me when I send some email, but it's usually only a few times a year to let people know what's going on with Rails Composer on the project. So here's some options that you might want to think about when you're starting your starter application, and this is an example of how Rails Composer can actually be very useful, because right now with Rails 5.0, Puma is the application server that's recommended as the default. Now, a year ago, it was WebRick or Thin, and if you haven't rolled up a new application in over a year, you might actually not know about that if you haven't been following mailing lists or blog posts or checked into what are the new features in Rails 5.0. So using Rails Composer actually shows you what's current recommended best practices. And in that case, we would enter number 1 for Puma, the default. The web server we would use for production, let's pick number 1 also, same as development, but if you were planning to deploy with Fusion Passenger, you could do that. Database used in development, we've all got SQLite on our machines, so I'm going to recommend picking number 1, and you could also pick Postgres or MySQL. Template engine, let's all use ERB. It's familiar to all of us, but if you want to use Haml or Slim, you can, and it will set up a starter application that's already configured with Haml and Slim and some basic page layouts that are using Haml and Slim. Test framework, if you're using Minitest, just choose none. It's already built in there for you. If you want to use RSpec, now see, this is an example. Like, if you haven't set up RSpec for a while, there's a couple, not just the gem, but some configuration files to set up properly, especially if you're going to integrate with Capybara. So here, Rails Composer will save you some time if you're planning to use RSpec. Continuous testing, I'll just say 1 right now because that's quicker, but you could have continuous testing with Guard. A lot of people want to do that. Front-end framework. Do me a favor, don't pick Bootstrap 4.0 right now. Bootstrap 4.0 is in alpha. Every time another version comes out, it seems to have a new way of doing things, a new feature set. It's an option if you want to use it. But I'm going to recommend picking Bootstrap 3.3 because it gives you over 24 Bootstrap themes already integrated in Rails Composer right now. So pick Bootstrap 3.3, option number 3. And Devise wants to be able to send email if you do a forget password. So pick number 2 for Gmail. And we're going to use Devise for authentication so that we've got user management, we've got sign up, sign in, sign out. Devise with the default modules, number 1. There's options, some people like to use confirmable, invitable. Those options are already baked in if you want to use them. This is really cool. A couple of years ago, most of us were using something, maybe Rails admin or active admin. These are gems that you drop in that give you an administrative dashboard, that give you basic CRUD operations on your database tables with just a gem in place. Those two, I don't think they're currently maintained or been upgraded for Rails 5.0, but ThoughtBot, the consulting company, has got this great admin interface called Administrate. So try it. This is the cool thing about Rails Composers. It introduces you to some new things. If you haven't tried ThoughtBot Administrate, you don't even have to go check out the GitHub repository and figure out how to set it up. Just choose it as an option in Rails Composer. We'll look at it later. Form Builder gem, some people like to use them. For convenience, let's just choose none right now. Here's the Bootstrap page templates. I actually ran a Kickstarter campaign about a year ago because this was a big project to improve Rails Composer because I found I was building applications and I'd use Bootstrap. The things I build, I don't have the luxury of having a designer to work with. So I just want something simple that looks good. Bootstrap does the job for me. I don't care if that looks like every other website on the planet that uses Bootstrap. There's a project called Start Bootstrap that's got 24 different Bootstrap themes, page layouts, and they've got a gallery of different ones to pick from. You'd actually have to go to the Start Bootstrap site, compare the different themes, and pick which one you would want to use. But I'm going to recommend number 21, Small Business. Will give us to show us how, give us a nice simple example of how you can integrate a Bootstrap theme with Rails Composer and have it already baked into your starter application when you start working. So if you're following along with me, you can enter 21 for the Small Business Bootstrap template. If you're building a website, you probably want some feedback about your visitors, about who's visiting the site. You're probably going to want to use Google Analytics. That's an option. You can pick number 2. I'm just going to say we're not going to deploy this site that we're building right now, so just pick number 1. I use something called Segment.io with loading a little bit of JavaScript. It gives you options. It's a service that gives you options of, I think, like 100 different analytics services that you can tie into and switch back and forth just to see what's working. Another example of how you can explore some new things with Rails Composer. But let's just pick none for now. And we can have an application that's ready for deployment as soon as it's done running. You could deploy it to Heroku, and it would set up your gem file the way you need it for Heroku. If you want to deploy using Capistrano at some point, you could choose that. And the last set of options, Rails Turbo Links. I don't know how you feel about Rails Turbo Links, but I always turn Rails Turbo Links off when I start a new Rails application because it always screws me up when I'm starting to add JavaScript. So generally, my way of working is turn off Rails Turbo Links, disable it, add whatever JavaScript I need, and then spend some time sorting out the Rails Turbo Links JavaScript mess if I end up with that. So for now, though, you can just say no. We're not going to do anything with JavaScript. And if you're going to deploy your application, you might want a robots.txt file so that Google doesn't visit your website before you're ready to have it show up in Google search results. And finally, Rails Composer will, on the fly, create a GitHub repository for you. So if you may be way ahead of me on this. If anyone's actually built the starter application yet, you could change directories into your project folder, run bundle install to install your gems, run Rails server, and what you're going to see, well, first of all, you're going to need to sign in. No, it's already done for you. You can sign in with user@example.com. The password is change.me, and this is what it's going to look like when it's done. It's running on Heroku. Thank you very much. But let's see what it does. So it's got a Bootstrap theme, simple Bootstrap theme. You could start jumping in and just hacking some of that front page around if you want. If you had to get something up, there's an About page, so you could start jumping in and just hacking on that. It reminds you that Rails Composer built it for you, so you know who loves you. You can sign in. Here's Devise at work already for us. Ken, it's user@example.com, and the password is change.me. I'm going to sign in. Did I get that right? We get the flash messages, already set up with nice Bootstrap styling. Among other things, we've got the sign in, sign out forms already set up for Devise with some nice Bootstrap styling. We've got this page, which Devise actually doesn't provide. It provides all the hooks for it, but it doesn't build the page. You can change your name, email address, password. You can even cancel the account. All that's already configured for you. I mean, we always need that, right? So why do we always have to build it ourselves from scratch every time we start an application? Here's Rails Composer for you. Here's a list of users. Now, I said that we built an application using Devise and Pundit. So this has got the authentication built in, and it's got authorization built in. So the first user that signs up gets an admin role. And as new users sign up, you can actually go in and change their roles to user or VIP. And that's just a line or two of code if you want to have different roles other than the defaults that are here, simply really as an example. And here's that admin dashboard, the ThoughtBot Administrate. It's not integrated with the Bootstrap theme we're using because ThoughtBot provides their own theming for it. But it's just for you to use as an admin. It provides all the basic CRUD operations on every database table that's built into your application. So it's kind of convenient. You can do all that CRUD, search whatever you want for your users and any other data records. Here we are back again, and let's just sign out, and I will tell you a little bit about what we're actually doing. What is it really? I said Rails application template. Not a lot of people use it, this facility. It's something like when you discover this application template facility that's baked into Rails, it's like a really cool thing, and you're like thinking like, oh wow, how much can I automate? Every time I build a new application, hey, maybe it's worth spending some time to write the script that's going to create my typical generic starter application that I use every time. And so people will jump into it, and then they'll put it up on GitHub, and they'll announce it on Reddit. And it's like, cool, I've got this new application template. Maybe you want to use that when you start your next new app. The problem is, and this is why Rails Composer exists, that it's a lot of work to maintain these application templates. Rails changes, and what typically happens is after a couple of months, some gem has changed. It doesn't integrate very well anymore, and that Rails application template that somebody's written is obsolete. It doesn't work. You go back to use it yourself, and it's like, oh, what the hell? I thought I was saving some time, but now I have to spend the time maintaining my application template. It would have been easier just to keep writing my application from scratch. So that's where Rails Composer comes in as an open source project. It just makes sense that if we're all building the same Rails applications to start with, why not do it as an open source project? And we've all got more eyeballs on it, and been very fortunate, I guess, that people have wanted to use it and have made the contributions. And the real value, not so much that it's an application template, but that people are using it and noticing issues and reporting issues and fixing the issues. It's just a Ruby script. It's just about 2,000 lines of Ruby script code. It uses the Thor API. If you're familiar with it, that's what's used internally in Rails to build any kind of generators. And you could actually see the code if you click that, follow that link. But you don't really want, and you could hack on the script itself if you wanted to change, maybe add a different front-end framework or something like that, but I don't recommend it. The project is actually using a separate gem to generate the starter application, to generate the application template. And the gem is called Rails Apps Composer, and it's me and sometimes a few other people who are actually using it. If you wanted to add new features to Rails Composer, which I invite you to do, email me. I'll walk you through using the Rails Apps Composer gem. Because the Rails Apps Composer gem is actually a whole collection of modules, of recipes, modules for setting up authentication, modules for setting up authorization. There's a separate gem actually sets up the testing. A separate gem sets up some of the page layout, and it's all tied together to actually generate the application template that's used to generate starter applications, which might generate business for you. So issues we'll fix in the Rails Composer gem. So that's the Rails Apps project. It's example applications. There's a dozen of them, and the idea is that they're reference implementations that we can keep up to date. There's Rails Composer that generates these starter applications. And finally, there's tutorials that I've written that explain every line of code in all the example applications. So it's great if you're a beginner and you want to see how a real-world Rails application is built. You could look at these example applications. It'll bring you up to speed as maybe an advanced beginner. And there's no mystery code. Every line of code in the example applications is explained in the tutorials. But there's a business model behind this, which I'll talk about in a minute. Because I wanted to introduce Rails Composer to you, but I'm going to segue here. This has been a great conference because there's such a mix of diving into tech and maybe some more soft topics and whatever. So I want to talk to you a little bit about review why you might want to use Rails Composer, but also tell you why I've been working on it. So obviously, if you use Rails Composer, you're going to save time. It's just quicker to get going building a Rails application. And it's not just a few minutes adding the gems to the gem file or integrating the Bootstrap theme. It's the time you spent getting up to speed with the latest changes to Rails. I started this project because I started building these open source example applications because I do some consulting for a few months, not always as a coder, sometimes in a CTO role. And I'd come back to work on my own projects, and I'd found that Rails had changed or some gem had changed, and I had to spend time just familiarizing myself with what had happened in the couple of months that I was gone. So when we create an open source application like this, and we share the responsibility for keeping something up to date, we save everyone, obviously, a lot of time. And that's one reason that Rails Composer is popular. Use it to build a starter application in a few minutes, and you have an up-to-date application reflecting current best practices, integrated, working together. Hundreds of developers are using the application, so if something breaks, even if I don't know about it, someone will open a GitHub issue and sometimes even fix the problem, thank you, when you do. Because programmers are lazy, right? We don't want to do something more than once if we can automate it. We don't want to repeat work that we've already done or somebody else has done. And people ask me, so why are programmers so lazy? And I think it's for good reasons, actually. It explains why we do open source. I think it's because we want to create genuine value, don't we? That's what drives us. Tim O'Reilly from O'Reilly Publications said, we should strive to create more than we consume. And as software developers, I think we often do that. And we want to do it efficiently, so we can create as much value as we can from our efforts. And that's why I started working on these example applications and on Rails Composer. It's a value multiplier. I create much more value myself by working on Rails Composer than on any given project of my own, because hundreds or even thousands of developers over the few years that it's been out are using the tool as a starting point to create value themselves for their own projects. So whether it's a hobby project or a startup business or an enterprise application, Rails Composer is giving everybody a lift up. But I want to talk a little bit more about the choice to lead an open source project because I want to let you know it can change your life. And it's changed my life. And I want to share that story with you. 2 years ago, I was at something of an impasse. I was living in San Francisco. I've lived in San Francisco for over 20 years. I love San Francisco. San Francisco has changed. The US has changed. I got to the point where I couldn't afford to continue to live in San Francisco and without giving up this Rails apps open source project. I realized I was going to have to start working full-time on commercial projects because this is something interesting. I want to leave this with you. I've actually been making a living working full-time on this open source project. I want you to know that that's possible. Because people think that an open source project has to be something that you do after hours at home, or maybe if you're lucky your employer lets you work for a few hours during the work week on open source. But you can actually support yourself with open source. 3 years ago, working full-time on Rails apps, the revenue model that I found simple. Rails Composer, the tool, the example applications are all free on GitHub. And I wrote the tutorials to explain all the code, and I'd sell the tutorials. Developers would purchase the tutorials for the education aspect. And that was enough 3 years ago to actually be supporting me with fairly cheap rent, so that I could work just full-time on this. Very satisfying, very gratifying. But my housing situation changed in San Francisco. I broke up with a girlfriend. I had to find a new apartment. It was going to cost me like $3,000 a month. I know we're in Utah, not San Francisco, but $3,000 a month or so. If I could even find a landlord who would rent to me, because I didn't have a job. I didn't have a pay stub to show, and there was 30 or 40 developers already lined up with cash in hand. So I was really wondering whether that was going to work out for me, whether I could stay in the city. I didn't know what to do, so I took a break. I went to South Africa. This was January 2015. Now I have an extraordinary life. I mean, it's really cool. So when it gets cold in the northern hemisphere, I can cross the equator and go to the south. And I'd been working all my life to try to get to the point where I had a business online where I could do something like that. And in January 2015, I realized, hey, let's do it. I can do that. I'm going to go to South Africa, where it's summer. And the plan was that I would teach a workshop for Rails beginners. I got in touch with the people in the user group community in Cape Town. And I'd stay a few weeks. And then I figured, well, I'd have to go back to San Francisco, look for full-time work, and shut down the open source project because it wasn't something I could continue doing part-time at the scale that I was working. So I went to South Africa. But South Africa did something to me. It's an extraordinary country. I want to show you some of the photos and some of the experience of my digital nomad life in the last 2 years since. Here's the view from Table Mountain, which is this huge mountain above Cape Town. It's an extraordinary country. Maybe you know some of the history of South Africa. Under apartheid, 20 years ago, they had a system of racial oppression, institutionalized white minority rule, not to put too fine a point to it, but privileged white people benefiting economically from a system of racial oppression. And Nelson Mandela, Nobel Prize winner, you know, and other political activists led the country to democracy with a nonviolent revolution. Extraordinary. The country is only 20 years old, and people have a sense of hope and possibility and this new opportunity with democracy. So the red arrow, that's Robben Island. It's kind of like Alcatraz off of San Francisco. It's a prison island close enough to the city so the prisoners can look out and see where they can't go. So I don't know that kind of cruelty involved in that. I always thought that was really wicked about Alcatraz. Robben Island. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned there for over 27 years. And also this man. This is Johnson Malambo. And I had the privilege, just a chance meeting, just coincidentally, I went to a Quaker meditation meeting, which is something I do on a Sunday. And this man, Johnson Malambo, was there celebrating his 70th birthday. And I got a chance to talk with him for a few hours that afternoon. Nelson Mandela, was the leader of the ANC political party, and Johnson Malambo was the leader of something called the Pan-Africanist Congress. And the two organizations led the revolution that brought democracy to South Africa. So meeting Johnson Malambo had a profound impact on me because, let me put it this way, ending oppression, bringing your country to democracy, it's a big-time way to create value. It's a really big value multiplier, if I could use that terminology. In terms of enabling other people to get ahead in their lives, wow, if you think about it, it's bigger than the biggest startup. I know I'm not going to create value in my lifetime like that, but it was inspirational to meet Mulamba. He's a heroic individual, making that kind of commitment to create value, not for himself, but for everybody in his country. And I thought, what is it truly to be a hero? To choose a greater good, not knowing how it's going to affect you personally. To embrace uncertainty, not to play it safe in your life, to be willing to say goodbye to the familiar and the easy. So in South Africa, I realized that the Rails Apps project is the best way I, as an individual, can create value for others. And so I decided to keep going. So I became a digital nomad. And I started looking for a place to live where I could cut my expenses and continue to be productive with this open source project. I crossed the Indian Ocean. I went to Southeast Asia. I went to Malaysia. While I was in Malaysia, here I am sitting on a balcony in a nice resort on the Straits of Malacca. I finished an example application, the ones that show how to integrate Stripe for credit card payments. And along the way, I become something of a, I don't know what to call it, maybe democracy tourist. When I was in Malaysia, I got to meet the people who were part of an anti-corruption campaign that's trying to reform their political system. In Malaysia, you can get arrested for wearing that yellow shirt. It's a non-political party. It just exists as a coalition to try to end the corruption, but the government has made it illegal to wear any symbol of that party. I went to Thailand. I stayed in Bangkok. I stayed in Chiang Mai in the north, which is like a big digital nomad destination. I wanted to check out why. The food's really good, and it's cheap to live. And there's a big community of developers, coders. Went to a really awesome JavaScript workshop in Chiang Mai. So while I was there, I revised my Learn Ruby on Rails book for beginners, so the beginners would have an easier time getting started with Rails. I went to Vietnam. I launched a Kickstarter campaign I mentioned for the Bootstrap templates that I've added to Rails Composer. Had to piece in some short-term consulting work as I went along. I could bring my team anywhere. So I brought my Bali, Indonesia. Here's my team working in Bali. Thought about living there. Because remember, my goal was not just to see the world or something like that, but I wanted to find a place where I could settle, that I could live well as I had been living in San Francisco and continue working on the open source project. Bali's great culturally, it's a beautiful place, but I can't live there. It's an absolute mess because of overdevelopment, traffic. Traffic makes it impossible for me to even consider living there. And all these pictures are on my Instagram. So if you use Instagram, you want to follow me on Instagram and see a lot more photos of the digital nomad lifestyle. Daniel, Miles, Kehoe, it's the longest name in the world. It's got miles between the Daniel and the Kehoe. I don't know what my parents were thinking. I went to Australia. I started making some videos because everybody told me people don't want to read tutorials, they want to watch videos. So I did a bunch of introductory videos to go along with the introductory book. And did some more democracy tourism in Australia. Here's some people, Filipinos in Australia, who are campaigning to end corruption in their government by electing a new president. Now, cute picture. The new president there is very popular in the Philippines, but he's very controversial outside of the Philippines in the international press. You may have heard about him. It was really interesting to notice the contrast between the coverage in the international press, maybe we could call it biased or a particular point of view, and how people actually feel in the Philippines about their president, the overwhelming support for him. So I ended up in the Philippines for the last 8 months. It's been a great place to live. It's been a great life. I'll say this, luckily we don't get incarcerated for working on open source projects. It's been a good life. It's not Robben Island. So that was the inspiration that got me thinking about doing all this. It's a much better deal, but it does take some courage. I'll tell you honestly, I don't know what I'm doing next. I've been working solo for a long time. I kind of would like to work on a team, whether it's remotely maybe or returning to the US. It all depends on what's interesting. If you've got want to have a conversation with me about something interesting that you're working on, I'd love to have that conversation. But I know even if I have the opportunity to work for somebody else, I want to keep working on the Rails apps project to keep it going. Maybe no more tutorials, because that's the big time-intensive, labor-intensive part of it. I want to do some upgrades to Rails Composer in the next month or two. This is kind of looking forward to what might be coming with Rails Composer. Rails 5.1 is going to be out soon, within the next month or two. It's got better integration with the JavaScript frameworks, and it's got new ways to handle configuration values. I want to upgrade Rails Composer for Rails 5.1. I'd also like to add some more example application for Rails. People suggested to me. I'd like to take the time to build some example applications using React. Tisha's going to be talking about React after lunch. Angular, Vue.js, maybe an API example. I'm open to suggestions too, so please get in touch with me if you have some ideas about how Rails Composer could be more useful to you. And the last time I was looking at a big upgrade to Rails Composer, I ran a Kickstarter campaign. I'm going to do that again. Here's a shameless plug. If you like Rails Composer, you want the upgrades and improvements, whatever, there's a Kickstarter campaign. And where am I at? That's all I'm going to say about Rails Composer right now. The real reason I'm here is to inspire you, or at least give you something to think about. I think the most important thing we can do in our work life is to create value for other people. And I'd like to suggest to try to create the most value that you can, do the greatest good that you can. And that might mean working on an open source project, or it might mean writing blog posts more often, or writing tutorials for others. But be willing to make personal sacrifices. Be willing to take chances and embrace uncertainty. I think that's the lesson I've learned in the 2 years. I'd say, this is a quote from Tennyson about Odysseus, from his poem Ulysses. And the poem concludes, he says, the voyage of the hero is to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So be like Odysseus, be willing to leave the comforts of home. And maybe that means being a digital nomad, if that appeals to you. You can ask me about that if you want. But I'm speaking metaphorically, really, about the comforts of home. And if you do, I think you'll have an extraordinary life. At least I can say that's what's happened to me. So I'm very grateful, and thank you for having me here.
Have you ever thought about making a setup to wire Angular on the front end, or some other JavaScript framework on the front end?
Yeah, that's what I'd like to do next. People have asked me about that. I'd been waiting, really, and I waited a long time to see how the dust settled with JavaScript frameworks. I wasn't sure where the effort was going to be worthwhile with all the changes that happen in that space right now. So I think we're now, we'll see how long it lasts, but we're down to React, Angular, and maybe Vue.js has a lot of appeal. So I'd like to work on that next. And I certainly welcome anybody who's got some experience who wants to help me with that.
Yeah, I'll also say thanks. My open source project was started with Rails Composer a couple of years ago. So,
what's your project?
It's called OpenSplitTime.org. It's a time tracking software that helps nonprofit races do their thing.
Awesome.
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
OpenSplitTime.org. Okay. Yeah. Might be worth knowing about.
Yeah. So, this is a very simple question, but how does Rails Composer determine what version of Rails? I didn't see an option for 5 versus.
It doesn't. Whatever version of Rails is installed is in the environment when you run Rails new is the version that you'll start with. So sometimes people have trouble with that. I do the talk and I point out the Bootstrap page templates, and then they're like using Rails 4.2 and Rails Composer won't work or doesn't end up configured. It's an older version of Rails Composer. So whatever version of Rails is installed, it's the same thing as Rails new, because we're really just piggybacking on that generator function that's already built into Rails. So if you're launching with Rails, I don't know what happens right now with Rails 5.1. I don't know what I'm going to get because I haven't had time to start working on it yet. Okay, another question.
Is there a provision for upgrading? Something I like the idea of where you're taking the best practices. So suppose I make a Rails Composer app a year ago. Is there an option or possibility in the future of running Composer again that would either upgrade what I already pre-installed or at least tell me that this has changed, this has changed, this has changed?
Oh, I wish. I wish. I think we all wish that that would be possible. Because wouldn't it be awesome if, you know, that Rails 4.2 application that you built 2 years ago and, you know, maybe the client doesn't have much budget for you to do an upgrade, if we could just run a magic formula command line and just have it. I don't know if anyone has worked on that. But no, I'm sorry, Rails Composer doesn't do it because we piggyback on the Rails new. There is, I've seen mentioned a couple of times that there's some hooks or some way that it might be possible, but I've never explored it in depth. It's really just for first-time apps. More questions? Am I not seeing anybody? Any thoughts about? Throw up your hand if you've seen Rails Composer before. Did you encounter it before? Yeah, you know, this is really interesting because it started, and it's taken a couple of years that people, you know, seem to now be aware of it as an option. Because I only see the tip of the iceberg. I see, you know, the GitHub issues being reported when something doesn't work. Sometimes somebody, this is what keeps me going, actually. It's been a full-time project, and I sell the tutorials, but really what keeps me going is when people let me know, email or leave a comment at GitHub or something that like, hey, you know, I was able to, you know, here's the startup that I launched, and it got me, Rails Composer got me started. I'm like, awesome. I'm so glad it was useful to you. Any other thoughts or questions that you have for me? Yes?
I noticed there wasn't an option for unit test.
Yeah. The question was, there's no option for mini test on the screen. Mini test users, you can tell me if I'm missing something there, but I use RSpec. So this is the issue with Rails Composer. I really only can maintain the options that I actually use myself. So if I use some options myself, and that's typically ERB, not HAML. It's typically RSpec, not Minitest. It's typically Bootstrap, not any other framework. I know about those problems. I'll enhance them. I'll keep working on them. When it comes to other configuration options, and this is where there's the experimental, the custom version. A lot of people use that custom version. But if you get into that, you're going to have to start sorting stuff out. So when it comes to Minitest, I don't use it, so I don't know what else is needed. And if somebody's using Minitest and it's like, oh, you know what, I run Rails Composer, but I still have to jump through a couple more hoops before I can use Minitest, you should let me know. Maybe contribute a pull request or a patch if you can, but at least let me know, hey, you know, when you set up Minitest, you need to like set these configuration files or something like that. So.
You know this guy that knows a little bit about Minitest. You might be able to.
Great, I'd love to get together. Cool. Evangelist. More questions, more thoughts. Anyway, I hope that's a good mix of the tech and also some inspiration to get you jazzed, because this conference has been really cool. I really love the vibe here. That for me, I notice, you know, it's the reason we come to conferences like this, is to, you know, be in touch with, you know, what is possible in our community, best, brightest, and to be inspired when we go back to work, you know, on Monday or something like that. So thank you very much.